Hi, I'm Kyle,
And I'm Whitney.
and today we're covering the material for the 6th of Tishrei, a little late because we all got sick. And we'll be talking about Revelation 6, where the nerding out intensifies a lot. From here on out, the amount of material we could cover just becomes insane. So we're forcing ourselves to do broad brush strokes.
A large part of that, I think, is because this part is really hard to understand and we don't have the answers for all of it. So we've dug in a lot in an attempt to try to understand it, and we still don't understand it. So we're not going to focus necessarily so much on what does every single little thing mean. We're going to be going through and talking about the structure of what we have here, talk about patterns and what we do know for certain.
Hmm.
And there is definitely some traditions and common understandings, I suppose, is what you could say, with how people read this chapter specifically. And we'll discuss that as we get there.
Mm-hmm. So I guess there's a few things we want to kind of housekeeping do so we understand how and why we're talking about what we talk about going forward before we dig into the text. One of the big things is I just want to reiterate us with our Western minds. We love a chronological presentation of facts.
Mm-hmm.
We like to assume that when we're given a story, we're being given it in order, in chronology. And that's, first of all, not every culture's storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cultures don't do that. The other thing is that's not always what you get in prophecy. We see a lot of the prophets get prophecies for multiple nations at once, and they go through and talk about them each falling, and they don't always fall in that order.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to just beware our Western ideas of, well, he tells us about seals and then about trumpets and then about bowls. So that means that in time, our experience is going to be unfolding seals and trumpets and bowls.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and we'll talk about that in a second, of the structure of Revelation from here for the next 10 chapters. Is again a cyclical structure, just like we saw a cyclical structure in the addresses to the different churches. We now have a 10 chapter arc of cycles in the seals, trumpets, and bowls.
So, a way that we've kind of come up with how to describe this to help us understand it is making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which on the first point of looking at it seems like a pretty easy thing to explain. That's because you're familiar with a peanut butter jelly sandwich. You know what we're talking about when we say that, most likely. But let's say you had no idea what this food was. We could talk about something from some other country that you don't have any knowledge of, and it would give you this idea. Mm-hmm. So let's just talk as if it were a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Well, let's start from all the ingredients. We're going to discuss where the jelly comes from. So by that, we need to discuss grapes. Let's say we're going with grapes. And the process that you would need to go through to make jelly. You're also going to have pectin. And so that's going to introduce bringing a cow into the mix here. And then we're going to have to talk about the bread. The bread, you need a field and you need to grow this crop so you have the grain, and then you're going to need to mill it, and you have to explain all the process for making bread. You need to introduce eggs. There's all kinds of elements that come into just this one ingredient. And likewise with peanut butter. And then you put them together. You can't understand the whole thing necessarily in a clear sequence. You can because you're familiar with what's going on, but like in Revelation, you're not going to necessarily understand the chronology and why are we going into this and why we're going into this. It's ultimately so it can be put together and will be something that makes sense in the end. And this is something that when we are in heaven, it will be clearer, I think, to us because we will have experience. We will be familiar with what just happened or whatever. And so someday on a different side of this life, we will see this peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but right now it's just really confusing.
Mhm. And that's what we want to avoid, is making the mistake of thinking that because we get explained how you grow wheat for the bread, how you grow vines for the grapes, and how you grow peanuts for the peanut butter, um, what we want to make sure we're not doing is saying, so chronologically, I have to grow the grain before I start the grapevines.
Right.
And that's kind of the danger of what we might run into, because it's explaining the ideas, not necessarily the chronology of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm finding as we're going through this, because there's so much with the feast, that there is imagery in these. And we had thought, oh, we'll introduce some of the stuff about the feast as that feast arrives. But yet there's so much imagery that pertains to a feast that we're not yet at. And there's familiarity that you need with what the traditions are around that feast to get the full effect of what's going on in the chapter. I feel like we're kind of experiencing that a little bit here too, as we're trying to explore and see what all the text has for us.
Mm-hmm. And so then I said we'd talk a little bit about the structure, and I think that's important, because I have never been to a Bible study about Revelation where they talk about the structure of the book. So what the scroll introduced to us is this arc that's going to persist for about the next 10 chapters, where you have 3 groups of 7s, where we're going to have 7 seals, which we'll get through 6 of the 7 tonight. And there's a reason for that. Then you have 7 trumpets, and then you have 7 bowls. And in each case, there is an interlude between the 6th and 7th object. So between the 6th and 7th seal, there's an interlude. That's why we won't get through 7 seals, because it dives into the interlude in the next chapter. Between the 6th and 7th trumpet, there's a bit of an interlude. Even between the 6th and 7th bowls, it's not a huge interlude, but it takes a little bit of time to describe these 3 spirits and what they do. And so we see, when you see a pattern like that, that's cyclical in Revelation, or really any prophecy for that matter, it should make you kind of pause and take note and go, well, what's going on here? Why is it doing the same thing over and over? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the functions of what's behind this structure, you are opening a scroll by breaking seals. That's a way to deliver an important message. And then you have trumpets, that is calling alarm to something important going on. And then you have these bowls of wine, which is another way that prophetically God delivered messages to, where I believe it's Jeremiah was instructed to take cups of wine out into all the earth and deliver it to all the nations. So all of these are mechanisms for delivering messages. So perhaps what's more important is that we grasp the message that's being sent, then be able to create a one-to-one timeline of when each element is going to unfold.
And again, taking what God translates for us. What is this stands for this. This is what this is. Let's pay attention to those things, because we know those things for sure. And we can look at scripture and kind of see what we can find that's similar to the others. But, well, shall we read through?
Yes.
Okay, so it is the 6th of Tishrei, and we are reading Revelation 6. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened a 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures, saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine." Then he opened the 4th seal. I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they'd borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on these who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? So as we looked at the structure here, let's look at what we see of just these seals. There is a little bit of similarities. I wrote down on a notebook paper to kind of see what this was, because we have who's the first person talking and who's calling, because some of these are being called out and others just are. And then some of them are given something or told kind of what they're allowed to do. So that was kind of the structure that we noticed, I suppose, as far as this chapter goes.
And what you'll probably recognize is what probably popped in your mind immediately was what we see throughout our culture. Of the four horsemen of the apocalypse has become a trope that's used even into our fiction. So even secular fiction includes these idea of four horsemen coming as heralds of the end of times. But as you look at them, the tradition of the four horsemen is war, famine, plague, and death. Then when we really break down and look at the descriptions here, we find that our tradition is actually pretty erroneous, and a whole bunch of leaps have been made to arrive at some of the conclusions that we've arrived at. And so if we take pop culture, we're going to make some assumptions about these four horses and their riders that aren't actually in the text.
Should we talk about that, or should we wait till we...
And I guess kind of what we'd like to do is we'll just spend a little bit of time pointing out from the text some of the difficulties of this model, that these are four horsemen of the apocalypse that are heralding the end as war, famine, death, and pestilence. And the first thing that sticks out is that war, famine, death, and pestilence aren't ever mentioned until the fourth horse with that fourth seal. And that these are not things that are new to the end of days.
Right. In just the book of Jeremiah, there are at least 17 times just in that book, at least, there could be more, that it has those three words together: the sword, the famine, and the pestilence. And so it's a big theme as you go through there. And many other places I found it too, just outright called out. I have a little personal theology that you could even look at the curse in the Garden of Eden and kind of see a reflection of these things put together there, but that's a whole nother nerd fest.
So at the first seal, we see a white horse comes out, where the rider has a bow with him. It's not given to him, it's something he already has. And he's given a crown and told to go out and conquer, and then he goes out. And this doesn't match the description of any of those four horsemen of war, plague, famine, or death. In fact, this could be seen as Jesus. There's a lot of the imagery here that matches him, where he's on a white horse. The only other place we get a white horse specifically mentioned in such clear terms is later in Revelation. And no one argues that that one's talking about Jesus. He has a crown, which again sounds rather Christ-like. He draws a bow, which draws my mind to the story of Noah, where he puts his bow in the clouds.
It's like he's hanging up his bow to not
destroy the world.
Right.
And so I'm not dead set to hammer that home and say this is what it is, but it's important to see that's closer than any of the four that we see listed in pop culture. Then the second seal, we get the red horse.
Yes, it's the red horse and the rider. Now it's important to also notice it's not just a horse. There's a rider on all of these guys too.
This isn't the My Little Ponies collection of apocalyptic horses.
Apocalyptic pony. This rider is given something. He's given a sword. So if we were assigning things like that model is, well, this would obviously be the sword or the war, right? Is that, and then it says that he's permitted to take peace from the earth, but yet he's not the one that's doing anything. There's not a directive of he came forth and he slaughtered people. It was that people slayed each other. So there's this discord amongst the people.
So we see this is more of a spiritual power than a physical action that's occurring, at least in this case.
And this is something that we could say is presently going right now. We see this. We saw this with Cain and Abel. So as far as chronology goes, I don't know. Like, what is
right.
this?
The third horse is the black horse, which in Bible school I was commonly taught is famine, because he comes out with the scales and a voice gives him prices for various commodities. And the way that I had it pitched to me in Bible school is that these are high prices, so it's indicative of a famine. And
we're also trying to fit the ponies to
right. They're trying to fit that together. Admittedly, I didn't do my usual digging that I do for a full sermon. But I kind of poked around and was like, okay, so like, if these are famine prices, what's a normal price, for a Roman citizen? So I poked around and I was able to find a couple of ways to look at this.
He nerded out. He didn't just poke around.
Well, I only looked at two things. One thing that we got in around 300 AD is this edict from the Emperor Diocletian. And he put out this edict as a form of government price controls to try to curb inflation that was going on. And ultimately, Diocletian winds up, historically, if you look at his story, he brings a lot of peace, ends a lot of conflict in the Roman Empire during his time, and actually brings some level of economic stability with it as well. But he's issuing this edict to try to control prices down. So these prices listed in the edict would be a pretty good price for commodities in his day, and he's not under a famine. So the price is given in Revelation is wheat, 1 denarii for a quart. The prices given by the Diocletian edict has wheat sitting at 12 denarii per quart. So wheat at 1 denarii per quart versus 12 denarii per quart. It's not too hard to see that this is cheap.
During a famine, prices would be driven up because the scarcity. And so this is 12 times lower.
So this is basically what would look like is to a Roman in 300 reading this, wheat for a denarius would sound like bread 91% off. That's a really good deal. The barley is 4.4%, getting 3 quarts for a denarius. That would be like 96% off your bread. So these don't line up with the narrative that that's a famine price. Another way I thought to look at it was, okay, well, what if I restrict myself to scripture? Where do I see famine? And you get a pretty extreme example in Second Kings 6, chapter 6 and 7. And it's extreme because it swings very rapidly from a very bad famine to a time of plenty. And so basically you have Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, comes in and he puts to siege Samaria. And they enter a famine because when you're under siege, you can't farm. And the prices given there is that a donkey's head sells for 80 shekels and a half quart of dove dung sells for 5 shekels of silver.
They're obviously hungry.
So, and you have to do a little bit of converting, and which I chose to do by the method of just the weight in silver. So a denarius at the time that John is writing probably has around 3 to 3.5 grams of silver in it. A shekel is easy because that one's set in the Torah. They can't change it. And it's about 10 grams, about a third of an ounce of silver. So for this period of time, we can say roughly by weight, a denarius is, there's 3 denarius per shekel. So that winds up with dove dung in this famine is 30 denarii per quart, which means dove dung is 30 times more expensive than wheat in the Revelation verse during this famine. So that doesn't sound very famine-like when you can compare, 30 denarii for a quart of dove dung versus 1 denarii for a quart of wheat. And so what Elisha says is he says, hey, the famine is going to end and you're going to be able to buy basically 2.25 quarts of wheat flour for a denarii. And these are crazy good prices. They're so low that the royal official in the city says, if God himself opened the windows of heaven and poured the grain out for us, could that even happen? Mm-hmm. And Elisha says, okay, well, then you'll see it, but you won't get to eat it. And that's exactly what happens. And they wind up getting those prices because the army that's been besieging them spooks, everybody leaves, and they're able to ransack the army's camp, and they have a surplus of food, so prices go way down. So the Revelation price is about double the price of Elisha's bounty. So is double a lot? Well, no, because this is an unbelievably good price, literally. So like if I said bread for 10 cents, oh, well, it's actually 20 cents. Would you suddenly go, we're in a famine? Probably not. So that leaves me with, I don't know what to do with this rider. He has scales.
Not as far as fitting it into this
in a famine narrative.
Famine sword. And this one actually, it feels like there's the least amount about this rider because he's not given anything. He comes with a scale, so he's measuring things. We kind of played around and looked around and saw like temple sacrifices with the different grains and the oil and the wine mentioned. But honestly, there's, who knows? Right.
There's maybe, with the crops or the commodities listed are a little bit reminiscent of grain and drink offerings for consecrating.
One thing I think is kind of interesting, though, is this quote of, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and don't harm the oil and wine. That, it says, is a voice that comes from within in the midst of the 4 living creatures. So from the last chapter that we had the one that had the likeness of a lion, an ox, face of a man, and an eagle in flight. Those are the 4 creatures that we're talking about. And so those are the ones that are calling these horse and riders forward here, and yet this is a voice from the midst of them. So that's kind of interesting, I think, too.
Yeah. So the 4th seal, we're called to look at the 4th horse, which the rider is explicitly named as Death.
It's the only one that we have.
And Hades follows him. And so the 4 horsemen that we usually hear about are all basically explained as tools he uses to do his job. He kills with the sword, with famine, with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth, which, by the way, we don't have the wild beast pony. So that's the missing fifth horseman, apparently. Uh, so it just, there's some trouble with that model. So don't assume everything that you've heard
Or
in
read
pop culture.
or read in your
Is,
commentaries. There's a
mm,
lot that, as we've studied this, I go,
right.
just, and it's not that you have to let go of them either, but hold
Hold
loose.
open hand of
Open hand
faith.
of
Yeah.
faith.
Let the text be your guide. And if the text disagrees with something you've heard, be willing to let that go.
And part of the importance of that is you don't want to be deceived. There's a lot of things that, somebody could be distracted by what's here and get too attached to a meaning for something. And what a shame for them if they were to miss the actual importance and the actual message here that we're given by a distraction that wasn't supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. So in the fifth seal, we have a change of gears because we've had, a similar vision for the previous three seals or four seals. And the fifth one, something a little different happens. John looks and sees basically martyrs under the altar, which this is a little bit mysterious imagery. We're not quite sure what altar they're talking about at this point. And some of that is this throne room seems to be mirroring the layout of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle has a couple of altars.
Right. You have the altar of incense, and then you also have the altar that they would have had the sacrifices.
Mm-hmm. And then what does under mean? Is it, like Atlas carrying the globe? Are they under the altar bearing it up? Is the altar like constructed with a niche underneath that you go?
I kept picturing like the not, no, I just totally lost the word.
Mm-hmm.
But picturing up somebody under the lectern, there it is at a church, like hiding under there in that little space. Yeah. Or are they in front of it?
Like, right. Are they at the foot of the altar?
Yeah.
Or are they like literally in where the coals burn, providing the heat to make the offering? It's not super clear. And given the fact that this is prophecy and therefore pseudo dreamlike, it could be any of these. And we're not told very specifically. Right. So ultimately, what's most important is that they have a proximity to the altar, whether it be the altar for offering or the altar for incense, as our analog to understand it. Mm-hmm. But what this does do for me is it casts some doubt in my mind that the seals are causal. So what I mean is, before this point, he opens a seal, one of the creatures says, "Come," and then you see a sign. And that leads us to the assumption that the seals are causing the horses to come forth. Right. But this one has a different feel to it. The seal opens and he observes a group of martyrs.
And the first you hear is the martyrs speak. It's not someone calling them forth.
And what the martyrs ask for is basically judgment on the earth for their blood. And they get told, no, you have to wait. They're given some comforts, but they're told that they have to wait because the number of their brothers to be killed for their faith hasn't been complete. So if the seals are causing the things, why didn't it cause all of this one? It only caused it partway. There's some of the martyrs, but their number's not full. They have to wait, so it's not all the way over yet. It's like we walk in the middle of a narrative for what John observes after this seal, which kind of makes me go, maybe we shouldn't look at it so much that the seals cause the things, but that the seals are correlated to the ideas that John has presented.
Well, and you think about what has happened here. This is John, and he's the last living disciple. They have all been martyred. So thinking of it that way, these are his friends.
Yeah.
Very probably. Among them, anyway. That there has been people being killed for the word of God and for the witness they've borne at the time that he has seen this already. And we know that there continues to be throughout the world now.
Mm-hmm. And then the sixth seal is broken, which has a whole bunch of that kind of classical apocalyptic imagery. The sun goes black, the moon goes dark, there's huge earthquakes, the mountains and the islands are removed from their places, the kings and the rich and powerful people hide in among the rocks of the mountains, which I thought were moved, but they're apparently there enough for people to hide in. Again, the
We're not
swirling
clear.
imagery. And they're trying to hide from the face of him who's seated on the throne and the wrath of the Lamb.
Something that caught my attention about this was tonight, as we've been studying Revelation, we were doing devotions with the kids, and the one that we did tonight was talking about the crucifixion. And there's shofar phrases that popped into my mind as we were reading it. Things like the sun was darkened and rocks split. And so there's a lot of similarities there between what happened at the death of Jesus and what's happening here. This isn't talking about the same event because there's
Right.
other things.
But that there's like the same kind of power when Jesus was resurrected and showed a little flex of his godly muscles. It's like this foretaste of what we're going to get
Right.
when he comes back.
Right. There's so much imagery in this seal too, that we would like mega nerd fest out on any one of them, and we'd love to talk more. So if you ever want to, we'd love to. But for the sake of time, we wanted to point you to other places in Scripture that give the same sort of description, and some of them might give a little additional, some of them might give a little more structure, and it's just really good to be familiar with all of them, to kind of put them together and hold them in your head, and to read it. It makes other places of Scripture that sometimes are kind of intimidating, like the other prophecy, having that familiarity and seeing, oh, okay, this is in Revelation too. It's just kind of neat to look at that. So like one of the first ones I would say is Jesus himself speaking about this in Matthew 24.
And he points out to his disciples that the temple's going to be destroyed. Hey, these rocks, not one will stand on top of another. And the disciples ask, when will this happen? And something important to notice is the disciples package two events together in their question. They package, when are these events going to happen? When's the temple going to be destroyed? And what are the signs of the coming of the end of the age? What are the signs of the end? Is packaged in there with their question of when's the temple going to be destroyed, which leads me to conclude they assumed these two things would happen concurrently. And with where we stand in history, we know after 70 AD, they did not occur concurrently. That temple was destroyed, and Jesus did not come back at that time. So it's worthwhile when we read that to understand portions of what he's talking about may be pertaining more to 70 AD.
And I believe it's earlier on in that chapter is talking probably more to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And then you continue and it gives you the same kind of imagery as it does here in Revelation 6 with the sun being darkened and the earthquake and whatnot.
The next place to look is the book of Joel, pretty much the whole thing. It's a pretty short book. And Joel is speaking of a day of the Lord with respect to Babylon. But as we see in Revelation, John uses Babylon as a parallel for a lot of what's happening in his visions as well. So reading through Joel, we see, again, very similar language, the same kinds of events happening, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving light. And the parallels are really, really tight and intense.
And I think it's important that we mention that too. When you read prophecy, very often it's not just a prophecy for one thing. Oftentimes God is amazing and he uses it as a dual fulfillment. There are two events being talked about at the same time. I'm trying to think of a good example, but there's...
And Isaiah 53 is a prime one, where we've got prophecy about the Messiah as well as prophecy warning them of the conquest that's coming from Babylon.
And it's just cool to see that God can use one set of words to describe multiple things and those layers. And that's why we like the shofar phrases, is it calls you back to, and you see this fit thread tying everything together, and it's just really really beautiful to see that. And then the last one that we'll just mention, there are many more than this, but the other one to read alongside this particular section is Zechariah 14. We love Zechariah.
Yeah. Which, and then to let some of my personal framework show through, for when I look at end times, I use these sections in Zechariah to kind of set the clock and the order with which I expect things to happen. And I like to do that because these sections in Zechariah ask to be taken quite literally, especially 14. It talks about real places. It compares them to other historical verifiable events like earthquakes that we can point to and find the year that happened. So everything about Zechariah's presentation, especially in 14, wants me to take him very straightforward and literally, whereas a lot of the presentation in Revelation is explicitly telling me that it's figurative and metaphorical. So when it comes to trying to set a clock for sequence, my preference is to let Zechariah dictate what order I'm going to read things
Which is
in.
good because it gives you a framework kind of that we assume. We're gonna go with that, hold it lightly, and see how it measures up and not measures up, but matches with other places and kind of get a better idea and framework of what to expect.
And again, you don't have to agree with me on that, but that's so you can understand how I work things out.
It's personally. Our bias, yeah.
Yeah. And so finally, we kind of want to go back to, remember there's the blessing for reading it aloud, the book of Revelation, for hearing it, and also for keeping it. So as we look at each chapter, we want to look practically at what is there in this for us to keep. And I'm drawn back specifically to that fifth seal of the martyrs. They are given a little comfort. They're given white clothes, which in the book of Revelation is often righteousness is given to them. And they're told to wait for what? For the number of their brothers that are going to die for the faith to be fulfilled, which tells us the number of martyrs is not done yet because God hasn't yet brought the judgment. So in order, as far as something for us to keep, again, this is that call back to the big overarching theme of perseverance, that we need to be persevering unto death. And in fact, in this day, there are Christians in many countries that are killed for their faith. I believe it's actually record numbers of Christians die for their faith in these years compared to even under Nero and Caligula type characters. So we who are very privileged like us to live in a nation where we're not facing death simply for our beliefs, we should be sure to keep stalwart because John looks under this altar and may well see friends because these are the souls of people who are martyred. He has friends that have been martyred. And we will see these people too. At the end, when we're all standing before God, are we going to be counted as their brothers who were willing to suffer and die for the faith because we persevered to the end, or are we going to abandon them and not be able to look them in the eye when we come face to face with them?
Right. It's a call to faithfulness to stick with Jesus and the words that he gives us and the message that he sends out, that even in spite of what man can do, it's not, it's nothing.